Hey guys, this is a Revelation class. We're going to pick up right where we left off, starting like 2.5 weeks ago, wherever we left off. If you're looking at your material that you have that Jim Jonas wrote, we are under week 10, day 3, starting in chapter 14. So basically, the layout of the kind of studies we're going to be doing online. We're going to go through the material as well as reading through the chapter, and occasionally I'll ask a question. And that is the time for you to pause the video and answer the prompted question. And I'll put those up on screen when the time comes. I think I've got 8 questions for this. And so if you answer the questions, if you get 7 out of 10, 8 out of 8, whatever, just you may want to email me and tell me how many you got right. So I guess that can be your homework. All right, so let's back up for just a second. Chapter 13, we're introduced to 2 beasts. A sea beast that comes out from the waters, and we've talked about the waters before. That already, what it represents, more likely represents earth, society, human society, things like that. And out of human society comes up a beast, and it's very ferocious. It's got horns. It's like an animal that's ready to devour. And we've talked about in times past, and we've done our best to say, and if you look on screen, you can see it. This is more likely talking about the Roman Empire, at least some facet of it, whether it was a Caesar or whether it was really just the Roman Empire itself. The sea beast that came up represents the Roman Empire. We know through history how strong they were. And you can see a comparison later on, because after the sea beast comes up, a land beast emerges. And it looks like a lamb, and we've talked about it before, right? How many times have we mentioned in the book of Revelation the lamb is Jesus, it's the Christ, it's an innocent being. But this lamb has little horns on its head, so you know that it's not exactly as friendly. And so the lamb beast, one thing that it's called about him in verses 12 through 15, he's a false prophet. And he starts compelling everybody on the earth, hey, I'm in league with that big sea beast, and I'm going to compel you to worship him. And if you read there with me, starting in verse 14, it says, talking about the sea beast, and he who deceives those who dwell on the earth by the signs which he has granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make the image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. And he granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, and the image of the beast who should both speak, and cause many who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So it was to the point that, hey, he compelled you to worship the beast, but if you didn't want to, you were going to suffer punishment for it. You were going to be killed. So I don't know how many times we've mentioned this in Revelation, but that's probably one of the bigger points in Revelation. If you do not do these evil things, you're going to suffer punishment. And Christians were going to suffer that persecution for that in that time. That's the whole book of Revelation. But time and time again, we see that if you overcome, if you continue in my will, if you keep my word, if you do my commandments, you will overcome, and I will give you a crown of life. So anyways, terrible situation for the Christians, right? It's a terrible situation. And so he does all of this, but if you decide to get in league with these beasts, you might want to read what it says right there in verse 16. He causes all, both great and small, and rich and poor, and free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark of the name of the beast or the number of his name. So, terrible things, right? If you don't get in league with these guys, you're not going to get that mark on you. And as a result of that, you're not going to be able to buy or sell. So the ramifications of that is financial ruin. You're not going to be able to, buy or sell. So economic hardship, and we've already seen that before, right? When the 3rd seal was open, the black horseman came out and he had the scales. We know about that, right? So this is just a foreshadowing that here is coming into fruition. So terrible things are happening, terrible things, to Christians who are not wanting to worship these beasts. So if you start reading right there in verse 18, it says, here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So at this time, I'll ask my first question. And you can pause the video as you need to. In times past, when we studied through Revelation, what does the number 7 mean? The number 7 means perfection. Means a completeness, especially if you're talking about divinity, God. We see that even early on, as into Genesis chapter 1 and 2, when he created the whole world. It's talking about a complete picture. Perfectness is basically the idea. And so if this mark of the beast, of this evil beast is 666. Basically saying you're one short of perfection. If you are a divine being and you are short of perfection, that means you are not really a divine being. Yet, time and time again, people in that time would worship the emperor, would worship the country, and you would feel compelled to do so also if you were a Christian. Because if you didn't do it, once again, you wouldn't be able to buy and sell. You'd suffer some consequences of that. Even going on to reading verse 15, it can even cause you to be killed. So that's why there were so many martyrs in that time. So many good Christians who fought against that. But basically, that's the gist of chapters 13. You have these two beasts, and it looks like a really dire situation right there for the Christians. But at this point, we could probably jump on to chapter 14, see what it says there. All right, let's start getting into chapter 14. So, dire situations for the Christians in 13. Chapter 14 is the complete opposite. It's a comparison. It's pretty much a chapter of victory. Starting in verse 1, Then I looked, and behold the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like a sound of many waters, like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. They sang, as it were, a new song before the throne, before the four living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from earth. So, can you guys recall earlier in the book of Revelation when these people were stamped who had the name of the Lord written on their foreheads? Well, now we're seeing that they're under the protection of God on Mount Zion. So compare what we just read with chapter 13, at least the way it ends, right? There are people who are going to have, that are going to excel in life, or for a portion of time, at least, because they had the mark of the beast. Now we're reading about the people who have the mark of the Lord on them, written on their foreheads. It's a complete different picture. They're the ones who are winning. And so they're on Mount Zion, and they're singing, as it were, a new song, 144,000. Here's your next question, which one of these religious groups takes that number literally? Okay, if you were to take that one literally, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they see that and they say, that's a real number. Something that a lot of people really struggle with. They don't really understand how symbolic Revelation can be. If you say that number is literal, then you'd have to say that in verse 4 it said, the ones who are not defiled by women, the one who are virgins, the one who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. You'd say those things are literal too. Is it true that only, not to be crude, but virgins get into heaven? Obviously not, right? But those are the people who struggle with that. But it is a number that means God's people. That those are the ones who are being protected right now. And they as it says, verse 3, they sang a new song. I'm not sure exactly what that means. If you think about Francis Scott Key, what did Francis Scott Key write? If he had never experienced the things he had experienced the night he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, probably never would have been written before. I imagine that they sang a new song because they only had a certain kind of experience that they were given under the protection of God. So they sang a new song, and that's just awesome to think about. But they sang the song, and as it says in verse 5, and then in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of God. So things are being good for the ones who have the Lord's name written on their hand. All right, moving on to verse 6 through 11. Thought good happens. So starting out in verse 6 said, then I saw, so he changes the imagery from the 144,000. He says verse 6, then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on earth, to every nation, tribe, and tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God, and give God the glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth and the sea and the springs of water. So just notice some of the things that this angel is proclaiming. He's proclaiming everything, and he has the everlasting gospel. I think that's something really important to bring out there. And he's preaching to every tribe, and he's saying you need to fear God. If you recall, chapter 13, people were not fearing God. They were giving all sorts of worship to the Roman Empire, but now the everlasting gospel goes out. And I don't know exactly how this plays out, in real life situation, but if we're going back to the times of the Roman Empire, maybe this was Christians who would go out when they saw everything that was going on around them, like in chapters 2 and 3, and saying, we have the everlasting gospel. We have the good news. We don't worship the king. We don't worship the emperor. We don't worship the Roman Empire as a whole. We worship God. And if you read on, verse 7 says, for the hour of his judgment has come. That's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big deal, something that's being said. And if you read on, starting in verse 8, it says, and another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen that great city, because he has made all nations to drink the wine of the wrath of her fornication. At this time, we're not going to get really deep into Babylon in and of itself. I think later on in the book of Revelation, we'll probably touch on it more. But it's basically saying, here's a great mighty city, and God, the one who raises up nations and destroys nations, is the one who's in charge, really, right? So you all see that there. He says, it's fallen. Its time has come. The judgment has come, said the first one. The second one said, now here's the judgment, basically. And reading on verse 9, and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image, so going back to chapter 13, and receives his mark on the forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out in full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night, whoever worships the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark on his name. So, can you just imagine that? Chapter 13, the Christians who said, we're not going to receive the mark of the beast. Okay, well, here's God's judgment. You have to wait for a time. You have to wait it out. And as some real life application, that's probably really hard to do, right? Wait out the hard times. But here's God making good on his promise. I will avenge my people. And so verse 13, he does exactly, or verse 10, he's saying, if you have been in league with the beast and his idol, you're going to receive the full punishment that you deserve because of that. And if you notice something just interesting, I want you to keep this in mind. It says, verse 11, how long does it say that they're going to rest? They're not going to rest at all, right? They don't have any rest day or night. And if you continue reading on, verse 12, it gets better. Here's the patience of the saints, and here are those who keep the commandments of God and their faith of Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, Blessed are the ones who are dead and who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may have rest from their labors, and their works will follow them. Can you remember the martyrs back earlier in, I think it was chapter 6, who were under the altar, who I think we're going to get to see in just a few moments? They were the ones who were saying, Lord, Lord, how long is it going to take till you avenge us? Well, here we're seeing some of that vengeance taking place. And he said, the ones who are in line with the devil and in line with the beast, you're the ones who are going to suffer for all eternity. But you who are a Christian, who have overcome, you read verse 13, probably one of the best, most hopeful verses in the Bible, saying, Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, that they may have rest in their works. So basically, the ones who are evil aren't going to be able to rest, but the ones who have overcome, have worked. And not that work gives us salvation, but in a little bit we can see how it works for our salvation. And it says, verse 13, and their works will follow them. So, really beautiful sight right there. So, you got the compare again from chapter 13, chapter 14. Big things are happening right here in what's being shown to us. All right, let's jump into verse 14. It said, Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud. On the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. So next question is, very, be kind of easy, but we need to ask it anyway. Who's verse 14 talking about? All right, so yeah, you probably answered right. It's talking about Christ more than likely, Son of Man. He's sitting on a cloud. He's got a sickle. He's got a crown in his hand, and I'm pretty sure those that imagery right there means a lot, right? We talked about what crowns have meant, but this guy's got a sickle. This guy, Christ, has a sickle in his hand. I've never been on the business end of a sickle. I'm very thankful for modern machinery, but I think you understand what's going on and what's happening here. This individual is ready to reap, to take the harvest by the head, pretty much. So verse 15, and another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, said, "Thrust your sickle in and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who sat on the cloud thrust his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Okay, so an angel comes out of the temple. Let's talk about that for a second. What do you think is indicated by an angel coming out of the temple and proclaiming something? What do you think is indicated by that? I see it as the temple being the dwelling place of God. This is God's will coming out and saying to the one who sits on the cloud, it's time to take action. So as we've seen in the earlier verses, he said, you're going to receive this judgment. So he takes the sickle and he reaps the earth with it. Basically, he takes judgment there. And we'll get into a little bit more of that. Continue reading on, verse 17. Then another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the altar who had the power over fire, and he cried out with a loud voice to him who had a sharp sickle, saying, "Thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." So, in addition to all of that, you have the imagery. If you look on screen, I'll put the imagery up there. Instead of an angel coming out of the temple, an angel comes out from under the altar. So an angel comes out of the temple, an angel comes out of the altar. It's the will of God, and now the saints, as I see it, this is them working in unison. Kind of some beautiful imagery being put there. It has another sharp sickle and said, "Thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." Okay, we might have to go back a little bit and talk about what it means to reap something. If it's talking about the earth as if it were a person, right? Well, it's grapes, it's deeds. Have you ever heard the phrase, "You're going to reap what you sow"? Sowing your wild oats. Her grapes are fully ripe. Her deeds are done. And so it's time to reap. So whatever the earth has done, at this point in Revelation, God felt that it was the appropriate time to take action. Okay. All right, continuing on, verse 19. So the angel thrust his sickle into the earth, and he gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. All right, so here's a good little study tool for you. What you're going to see on the screen, you're going to see a display of answers. Which one of these means winepress? Yeah, if you've seen it before, which you obviously have, the Garden of Gethsemane literally means winepress. That means you get grapes, olives, grapes in this situation, and you crush them. And you can imagine that playing out in Jesus' life, right? He is being crushed right before going to the cross, where he found himself in Gethsemane. Let's sneeze. Excuse me. Okay. So putting it into perspective here, the deeds of what earth has done is being thrown into the winepress to be crushed. And if you read on to verse 20, and the winepress was trampled outside the city, and the blood came out of the winepress into the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. So this here is the judgment of God, and we're going to see it later on in chapter 15, talking about the wrath of God through the bowls. But basically, God is angry with the earth for what they've done, so he's taking judgment on them. In how devastating verse 20 is, that, the blood, it's interesting that it's not grape juice that's coming out, but it's blood that comes out, and it's filling the entire earth. And the punishment is so great that it reaches up to verse 20, the horses' bridles. So you can't get rid of it, right? So it's all around you. God's wrath is basically, and it's so bad. A lot of people would probably look at this and say God's being too harsh. But guys, don't misunderstand that. They are only reaping what the earth's fruits are. So here's a Bible lesson for all of us as we wrap up chapter 14. We're going to reap what we sow. If you live a sinful life, God will be angry with you. God punishes that. And it's not that God is doing something that is just so terrible. It's just that we have reaped certain fruits, and that one day they're going to be sowed. One day they'll be harvested. So don't misunderstand the punishment of God here. I think that's a really good Bible lesson right here. So chapter 14 in a nutshell, before next week or in some time in the future we look at chapter 15. Chapter 14 in a nutshell, I think, is a really big parallel to chapter 13. The Christians are the ones who are losing there because the beasts are winning, and the people who follow the beasts are winning, and you're going to suffer hardships if you're a Christian. And chapter 14 starts, and it says those who have the name of the Lord on their forehead are really the ones prevailing. And it seems that even if you obey him to death, you still, even after death, it seems that you really want the reward. And God's, at the end of chapter 14, the second half at least, is really God's judgment starting on the earth. So a lot of the prayers of the saints that were under the altar are now being answered. So hopefully this helped you in some regard, and we'll pick up in chapter 15 in a future time.